Welcome to the Sorch podcast, where we explore Sikh and wider South Asian history, art and philosophy with historians, artists and researchers.
So once again, today I've got the pleasure to talk to Davinder Toor. I will save the introduction that we did for the last episode because I think everyone should go listen to that and then this will make a lot more sense. We'll be focusing on the pieces of arms and armour within your collection today. So the first piece that I wanted to start with, and I think this is more so because of the personal connection that I've got with it, so to speak, is the full suit of body armour. I remember first seeing that at the Golden Temple exhibition and I was like, I wonder what that's doing there. And then obviously you go up to it, you read the sign and it explained it. And then I think we had the pleasure of yourself giving us a far more thorough explanation. Now, because of how fascinating I found that, I just want to start with that. And obviously for everyone listening, I think they'd really appreciate it. So if you could just tell us a bit about that.
Okay, sure. So the suit of armour, it comprised a number of different pieces that dated to the early part of the 19th century. And the suit that was on display was a particularly fine set of armour in that it was entirely made out of Damascus steel, which was, worth its weight in gold at that time. It was highly prized and decorative as well as being functional. And it was chiselled and inlaid and in gold in two different colours of gold. And it comprised a helmet, a set of body armour, or a cuirass or charena, which means 4 mirrors. These 4 plates, front plate, back plate, and then 2 side plates. And there's some dastane, some gloves and gauntlets with the original silk-lined mitts. And then there was also a shield. And I think it took a lot of people by surprise, I think, when they first saw it, because I think as you stated in our earlier conversation, not many people would have associated Sikhs wearing helmets. And the fact is that some did and some didn't, and there's images through history, and there's various accounts of Sikh warriors wearing helmets, and you find them in paintings, in ivory portraits. You'll see images of famous Sikh warriors like Singh Nalwa, for example, wearing a helmet, and then when you start to kind of look a little bit closely at those helmets, which I think was the part of the armor that kind of intrigued most people, you'd see that actually you needed to have a turban on, the star on underneath, in order to wear that helmet properly. It had a certain amount of space inside, and often what the Sikhs would do is they would have a smaller piece of the star, a piece of turban that they would then wind over the top to secure that helmet down. And the helmet itself, not just even in its structure and design, it wasn't something that you could specifically kind of say that was definitively Sikh in style, because those helmets in that shape were used throughout kind of northern India, and it has a nasal guard and plume holders. The Sikhs were very fond of having heron's plumes in their turbans, and there was one suitable feather in each wing of a heron, and those plumes, they survive in you can find them in the collection at the V&A. We had some on display actually in our last exhibition in 2018. It was great. It was also great to, I remember we had a kind of articulated mannequin that the armor was mounted on. So we had quite a good kind of pose that we got the mannequin to kind of do, and it was, I think it was quite captivating, I think, people to see.
No, definitely. For me personally, it's still very clearly etched in my memory from when I saw it about 10 years ago now. So I think you're definitely right. You mentioned that heron's plumes were something that were quite cherished by Sikhs of old. Could you just explain a little bit about why that was the case and why it was that bird in particular?
I don't know why it was that bird in particular. I don't know whether there's any symbolic kind of significance to the heron. I know that the types of feathers, the types of plumes lend themselves to kind of being aesthetically pleasing when they're mounted in a plume, with many, many other feathers of the same variety. So when they kind of hang in a particular way. And we see these plumes in images of old, and they were both worn in helmets and in turbans, and within the stars. And it was a sign of royalty, nobility. The British the British wrote about the Sikhs kind of marching in all their various colours and dripping with, decorated weapons and armours. And they kind of described them as kind of strutting peacocks. kind of entering into this arena. And they weren't just Heron's plumes that were in these galgis, because you'll find in the book, actually, there's another one that I have which is made out of a monal bird's feathers, a Himalayan monal bird's feathers, and it survived so well. And the one in the book actually is designed to be worn in a turban, and it's you'll see from some of the photos that the colours are very iridescent. They reflect light in different ways, and they're just highly attractive. It would have been a combination of how they were in terms of their aesthetics and functionality, but I'm afraid I don't know anything about the symbolism, if there is any.
No, that's not a problem. The only reason I asked is because peacock feathers are sometimes associated with Krishna and Vishnu, and so I just wondered if there was a particular connection. But no, that's absolutely fine. Just moving on, in the collection, there's masterpieces of early photography, and some of them were taken by Maharaja Duleep Singh, or a part of Maharaja Duleep Singh's collection. I just wanted to get a little bit more information about what is in those photos, and if there's anything of particular interest that you could share with us.
Yeah, well, I think what's interesting when you start looking at Duleep Singh's early life and some of even the earliest accounts of him whilst he's still in India, before he's even been brought to England, there are references made to his artistic talents and his keenness, and this is before photography, to paint and to draw. He's very, very excited to have his portrait painted. He wants portraits of other people. He's artists such as Helen Mackenzie, who was a portrait that she did of him. It's in the book, and it came from the estate of Lord Dalhousie, and it's probably the earliest portrait of him after annexation. And she writes about how he's really excited, how he's really keen. And that seems to stay with him. And the reason that we know that is I don't know how many years ago now, but I managed to acquire a group of albums and photographs and various documents from the family of Dr. John Logan, who Dr. John Logan became Duleep Singh's guardian. Duleep Singh stayed with Logan and his family. Logan was previously the kind of the keeper of the Doshakana when at the time of annexation, when the treasury was still intact. And amongst these documents, it's amazing find, really, because I've managed to find various signatures and letters of Duleep Singh, and most remarkably was the original receipt of transfer for the Kohinoor diamond, which Logan's family still had. But one particular album in this collection had notes. There was drawings and photographs, and it was like labels that said Duleep Singh's first drawing, Duleep Singh's photograph of this place, and Duleep Singh's photograph here, and then you suddenly realise that as his artistic talents kind of naturally kind of progress and stretch into photography as that comes about, and so within the album you get to see his drawings and see some of the photographs that he's taken. You can't always tell which one he's taken, which one he hasn't. But there's one particular one that I'm pretty sure that he would have taken, and that's one of the Prince of Wales, the young Prince of Wales. And in this picture, and you can find the exact same photograph also in the Royal Collection. So you go to the Royal Collection Trust website and search some of the photographs there. It says that Duleep Singh was the photographer, and in this particular photograph, the Prince of Wales is sitting on a chair, and he's got this small Sikh matchlock gun that he's holding, and it's a matchlock made for a boy, and they're quite distinctive because of their narrow stocks, so you can kind of identify them. So it was nice to find. It was nice to find those pieces from the collection, knowing that they'd stayed there for all that time, and then to find these other little sketches and drawings that just give you a further insight into Duleep Singh's character as you imagine him here as a kind of young boy separated from Punjab.
Yeah, I think the bit that I found very heartwarming was when you mentioned like they were annotated with, oh, this is the first, like Duleep Singh's first drawing. And the reason why I guess that would be so kind of clear for some people is a lot of us have sons, daughters, nephews, nieces. Like my niece comes over quite often and she'll draw or she'll make a painting and like we'll put it on the fridge. I always enjoy these conversations because it brings a sense of realism to a lot of the history and picks away at like the popular narrative. So the image of Duleep Singh that most people will be aware of is the stolen heir to the Sikh Empire who was taken and dumped in England, and that's kind of it. Whereas I think having these type of conversations and hearing about like verifiable facts, as in you have the photos and you can show them, or they're on the Royal Collection website in this case, it just brings a completely real sense to history rather than it being, oh yeah, like this time long ago or whatever. But no, that sounds absolutely amazing. Just continuing with the photography theme, I wanted to ask you about one particular photographer, John Edward Sache. The reason I ask is because you're the only one who I've come across whilst researching to connect a photographer to a late 19th century photo of the Baba Atal Bunga in Amritsar. And the only reason that stuck out so much to me was because I was just researching into that area myself, and it was amazing to see that you had managed not to just find it, but then also connect it to the individual. I just wanted to get to know a little bit more about that photographer, and how did he end up in Amritsar at that point, and kind of the history of the photo, so to speak.
Yeah, I'm surprised that I'm sure somebody else must have identified that before I did. I don't think that those photographs are published in the books. Maybe you saw them somewhere else, maybe on Instagram or something. I don't think I put one of Sache's photographs in the book, but I'll double check. But he was of German Prussian ancestry. I think he's born in some part of the kind of German Prussian Empire, and he, like many other photographers, kind of travels far and wide and arrives in India in the 1860s. And the photograph that you're talking about, I think that dates to 1870, and photography and identification of certain photographs can get quite confusing. It can be quite tricky because a number of photographers start to arrive. The earliest photographs that we'll have are from the 1850s of the Darbar Sahib, and then and the surrounding areas. And then in the 1860s, 70s, more and more photographers arrive. So he's certainly not the first to photograph the Darbar Sahib or Baba Atal. But luckily, and this isn't always possible, but you really need to look into the corners of some of these photographs to find signatures of the photographers. And Sache has, on that particular photograph that you're talking about, he has a negative number and his surname, which helps us to identify him. The other ways that you would, later on, particularly with architectural scenes, is, you're looking for changes over time and the growth or disappearance of the trees, or buildings that have either appeared suddenly or been demolished over time, that give you a sense of when a photograph may have been taken. So he's an important photographer of the time. I think one of the most important photographers of the time, I think, that comes up is Beato, Felice Beato, who and some of his photographs you'll find in the book. He was, many of his photographs kind of date to the late 1850s, 1858, 1859. And he did a beautiful series of photographs of the Darbar Sahib and Amritsar. And I think I saw that you did quite a good research kind of write-up on him, didn't you?
Yeah. One thing that I noticed when I kind of restarted this entire thing was Beato's photos just get reused constantly on social media, and rightly so, actually, because they are brilliant pieces of photography. And I just wanted to know more about them and about the person, because I was like, if we keep sharing these and they're so great and the community loves them so much, who's the person behind them? And then I guess my inquisitive nature got the better of me, and I just went down the rabbit hole and put it together. And actually, kind of, his life is pretty amazing. He travels all over the world, and even for someone living nowadays, and if you were to read his list of destinations, you'd be kind of blown away. So thinking of him doing it all the way back then and everything that goes with it, it is quite mind-blowing. Equally, there's some kind of more sinister undertones to some of parts of his life. So he's been accused of almost constructing certain scenery, quite macabre scenery for some photos when he ends up in China, etc. But equally, he's like most of us, he's a product of his time. He's at the cusp of a new technology and he uses it brilliantly. And in fairness, the reason why we're talking about him today is because of how good he was and those images are. And then also to find out more about him also kind of helps understand, okay, well, why did he go to Harmandir Sahib? What was the reason for him being there? And then also some of the early photographers of kind of Nihang Singhs, etc., or just Sikhs are captured by him. So it's really interesting to know he went over there to try and capture the aftermath of the mutiny. And obviously some of the people he would have met would have fought on either side. And it just brings a more real sense of what happened rather than it being this kind of thing that happened hundreds of years ago and has no significance on us.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, he's, you mentioned the mutiny, and he's very famous for kind of his post-mutiny photographs, having just arrived kind of a year after it. And as you say, he's responsible for taking some wonderful portraits as well of officers who, 10, 15 years before were on the other side and fighting for Ranjit Singh, and or in the Anglo-Sikh wars against the British. And now they suddenly, find themselves on the other side, helping, particularly those of Hodgson's horse regiment, Maan Singh, Varaich, Jai Singh, these guys who then are involved in the mutiny. And I see it's funny actually because it's interesting because your timing of that, the research that you were sharing on him, for me, I can laugh about this now and share this with you. For me, you couldn't have come out at a worse time, really, because you at that time I was trying to buy this album of Beato's, which is probably the most significant collection of photographs of him that's surfaced on the market, and it came up for sale. And as a collector, when these things come up, you just want to kind of quietly be able to buy them. And then it was attracting kind of attention to it, and it was good. And it was, but it's interesting because it allows us to talk about something which is a bit interesting, which is, when I first started collecting, and our general mindset when it comes to heritage and antique is that it's so easy to just think that it must have been collected already, or preserved already, or it must be in a museum already. It's got to be too late. And quite early on in my collecting journey, when I would, read the name of Narinder Kapani, Dr. Narinder Kapani, who sadly died last year, I'd see this name and think, who's this guy that has this, has this collection, has these Sikh artifacts? And you start to search. And then I could start to see that he wasn't buying everything. And then I could start to see the things that he had either missed and it got me thinking. And I thought to myself, how do I shake myself out of this mindset where I think that this has already been collected and there's nothing left? What if, actually, right in this moment, maybe this is the moment that this collection needs to be made. Maybe the best stuff is yet to come. And that Beato album was a real kind of example of that, because Beato did 19 photographs, I think, of the Amritsar. And the complete collection, it doesn't exist anywhere of all of them. The V&A, I think, have maybe 15 or 16. There's a Canadian Institute of Architecture in Montreal that has a similar number. And I managed to find a complete set of Beato's photographs of Amritsar, thinking that I would never, ever find another set of his complete photographs. And then this album comes up, which you must be aware of. So I'm sure you referenced it. And this album had over 60 photographs of his, and all the Amritsar photographs, and then all of his Delhi photographs. And it was, the condition of it was like it was the day it was developed. It was just remarkable. And that's being found now, in 2020 or 2021. So there's lots of stuff, lots of art, that's just unknown to us. That's just waiting to be discovered.
No, definitely. I remember actually coming across that and thinking, damn, this is amazing. And I think actually now hearing what you're saying about the fact that actually there are still so many items out there that are popping up, this one being a good example. It's positive for people like myself who, I guess, starting or others listening actually who are thinking about perhaps starting some type of collection. Equally, I have to ask, did you get the album?
Yeah, I did.
Brilliant. Well, that's good. I'm glad you did, because I would have felt terrible had I brought all that attention and someone else had ended up buying it.
No, it's okay, because it's the way it is on one side, as I said, as a collector, let's say you want to buy things cheaply, I could have messaged you and said, come on, please don't promote this now. I need to buy this album. You're going to cost me a lot of money. But on the other side of it, I understand that this is, you've got to carry on doing what you do, and we've got to kind of raise awareness. We've got to share research, and even doing this book and doing the previous exhibitions from a collector's perspective, I'm shooting myself in the foot, because I'm attracting people to something that actually I just want to quietly go away and collect, and then prices start to go up and it becomes increasingly difficult. But that's not what it's about. If we can, I would love there to be another 10 people who are collecting, all over the world, because then we get to see more things. And that's, I think, what's crucial.
No, definitely. Collaboration, working together, just from the get-go. Most of this momentum has just come from talking to people like yourself, people throwing ideas around, people like, oh, why don't you try this? And along the way, I've had the pleasure to talk to so many different people in different fields, people who have just released books, people who have been in their fields like yourselves for years. And I think the beauty of it is just that, it's the collaboration. And I think what you've said echoes loudly, in that if you were completely just focused on collecting for collecting's sake, and it was just a completely private matter, then it would make sense for you to have messaged me or other people who perhaps were bringing attention to certain items and be like, I think you need to stop. But actually, that's not the case. The case is, I want to share as much as I can, and if that has a negative impact, so to speak, in terms of prices might go up, then so be it. I think that also does away with a lot of assumptions that people may have about private collectors, such as yourself.
I suppose. I mean, just on that point quickly. I mean, even I think the kind of misnomer really is the fact that let's say someone like me is called a private collector. I'm not private. Private collector. It says private collection where you don't know who it is. So that's the reason why I kind of quite happy to tell people that an object belongs to me or whatever, because it's not private. It's public, in the sense that it's that information's out there to be shared. I think it's better. We've got to over time kind of understand, well, what is the issue that people do have with private collections. I understand if it's an issue that private collections who don't share their collections. I think what we've got to start asking people whenever they have various issues around our material heritage is, at the same time when they present an issue, they ask them what their suggestion for a solution is. So if someone has an issue with private individuals collecting Sikh art, then what's the problem? But then also share your suggestion of a solution for that problem, rather than just airing a problem. Do you know what I mean? Because then that gets a discussion going and gets us progressing in terms of actually working out, is there a real problem there, and what can we do collectively, if anything, to solve it?
Especially coming just from a kind of personal angle, I think if people were really that concerned, you do something about it rather than just make noise. And so, for argument's sake, I could sit here and be like, oh yeah, there's already collectors like yourself, or there's already historians like yourself, Madra, etc. out there doing what you guys do, and there's no need for me to do anything. But that's not the case. The case is to keep going, to keep working together, and to collaborate and to continue. Just then continuing with the collection, there was one European artist in particular that again attracted my attention. I'm probably pronouncing this incorrectly, Lucien. What caught my attention was he was born not that long after the annexation of Punjab and died soon after partition. So in terms of his kind of lifespan, it would have been an incredible time period that obviously he lived through. One of the pieces of art that jumped out to me was the portrait of the Sikh from 1917. Now, I just wanted to get to know a little bit more about the artist and then about that piece of art in particular, please.
Yeah, Lucien Lévy-Dhurmer, he's what we would term one of the Orientalists, I suppose, and that kind of era where the West is becoming increasingly captivated and enchanted, influenced by the East, whether it's the Middle East or over India way. And he doesn't actually, the picture that you're talking about of, we should call him Yellow Turban for obvious reasons. He's on the front of The Eyes of Asia book that Kaji House did. And he's very captivating. It's a very captivating portrait of a Sikh, but Lucien, he gets into portraiture, from my understanding, quite late. He actually starts off in ceramics, and his work kind of becomes increasingly kind of abstract and mystical and spiritual, and then and he paints in various media. The portrait that you're talking about of the Sikh is called Le Sikh, is in pastel, and as far as I'm aware, there were three portraits, I think, that he did that with either solely of Sikhs or had a Sikh in there. And the first time, and this has happened to me kind of a number of times, is I actually often kind of I've acquired something the second time I've seen it, not the first time I've seen it, and I don't know why that is. Always, but I saw this portrait along with another portrait first surface in Paris, and I just thought it was too expensive. I saw it there, and it was with another picture you'll see these on the internet. Actually, it's a profile, double profile, where there's probably a Hindu soldier and in the foreground, and then a Sikh soldier, and that Sikh soldier in the background may actually well be the same one that as in our our yellow turban Le Sikh portrait. And so I didn't acquire it there, and then it came up a few years later, just before that 2011 exhibition, actually, because I think we put it in that exhibition, and it then surfaced again, quite locally to me, and then I managed to buy it cheaper than it was the first time. Interestingly, that portrait, I remember the auction house was a bit coy. They can't give away too many details as to who the previous owner is, but they hinted, and to me, that they said, it was a famous local musical artist, very, very famous, they said, and connected to the royal family, and who owned that picture before I bought it. And they couldn't confirm, but they kind of hinted that that picture was once hanging up on Elton John's wall. And I don't know if it was or not, but they didn't have a reason to lie because I had already bought it by that point. But the actual portrait itself is, there's such energy in that portrait. He's a beautiful man. He is. He's got this stoic energy that kind of comes across, wonderful features, and the yellow is so lovely, and just the style and the fluidity of the artist's kind of stroke is amazing. And I think I kind of hinted at this the last time that we were talking. When you find a work of art, you can't necessarily put this into words always, but it's often beyond that. You're looking at the expression, the energy that an artist has put into that work, and you really feel it. Sometimes it just jumps out at you, and then you feel it. And I often, I think that we're very much connected, human to human. We're humans that we're looking for, that we're observing, that we're seeing, that we want to talk to. And any work of art, is that communication, is somebody trying to tell us something that maybe they couldn't put into words that well. Maybe they're better off communicating through art or through music or whatever. And that's something that you feel in that. And you can understand at that time, Lucien, he was French-Algerian, of Algerian descent. And he's, at that time, World War I time, these Eastern soldiers are turning up. People are captivated by them, by their long beards and whiskers and wonderful turbans. And he really gets that. He's seen something there. And he's really managed to kind of freeze it in time in that portrait. It's a lovely, lovely picture.
No, definitely, it's one that when you see it, it really does jump out at you. You mentioned that particular image had surfaced up a couple of times. Now, just in general, artifacts within this field often come up again and again. Like I've noticed on certain auction websites, I think there's actually currently an auction going to take place in Shropshire with an auction house, and they've got items that I've seen auctioned previously. And I just wondered, obviously off the back of what you had said, is that kind of like a common thing that people will buy them and then put them back out into the market, and it just kind of goes from seller to seller?
Yeah, it can do. I mean, it's and it can happen for a variety of reasons. It can simply be that someone's in need of money and they want to sell something again that they had. It can be that previously it was bought by somebody who's making an investment, or it can be that somebody sadly passed away and their estate's come up for sale. So it's there are a number of different reasons why. It doesn't happen very often, but you can find that happening. This particular portrait, it came up for sale, but it wasn't sold the first time, and then it came back, and then it was sold. So yeah, so it can happen, and it's a good way also to historically, I've kind of gone back and kind of looked at the Sikh art market of the last 10, 20 years, and you start to you can build patterns that way. You can see, what people might be interested in, what they're not interested in, how things have appreciated or depreciated over time, if that's the case. So it's a good way to kind of track things,
No, that's absolutely fair. Another question that would be wonderful to get your input on is, so just during some of the research that I've been doing, I've come across auction houses and also museums that have mislabeled items horrifically wrong. There was there is an image actually of Maharaja Ranjit Singh Ji that the Durham University have in their collection, and they've labelled it as Guru Tegh Bahadur Ji. I have no idea why. We've got in touch and asked them to amend it and all the rest of it, waiting for them to get back. However, I just wanted to ask you, have you come across anything and you've been like, that is definitely wrong?
Yeah, it happens all the time, and it's we spoke about the contemporary portrait of Guru Hargobind in the US. Where there is a portrait in my book of Maharaja Karm Singh of Patiala, which is actually on the front cover of another book where it's being presented as Guru Gobind Singh. There's the painting that we mentioned from Lucknow, 1775, that previously was sold as Guru Gobind Singh and his sons. Actually, it's just some misildars. Singhs of Guru Gobind Singh. So it can happen, and it's not necessarily always intentional or due to lack of research. In your case, let's say with Durham, chances are that at some point somebody has labelled that probably a long time ago, not knowing, and then they haven't had reason to go back and look at it or question it. It's just they probably find out, actually somebody labelled it like this 80 years ago, 100 years ago, whatever. So in those instances, what you've done is right, and I would just add to that, you've probably done this anyway. But just if you're going to tell them that it's Ranjit Singh and not Guru Tegh Bahadur, you just share 2 or 3 examples of similar portraits that of in other public collections where you can show them that it's Ranjit Singh, and then they just they've got a bit of evidence to attach to it when they change it. So it doesn't just happen across the Sikh art world; it happens across everything. But it's we're at that kind of place where many of these works of art were sold off, as with generic descriptions, an Indian Maharaja, for example, or I've got that portrait by Schoefft of Maharaja Sher Singh that was found at Portobello Road Market, and it was just, look, here's an Indian king, it's Maharaja Sher Singh sitting on Ranjit Singh's throne, so it's it happens, and it quite easily, remember, this information can get lost from one generation to the next. If we don't document this, let's say if I don't document anything, and my kids haven't seen my stuff, and then suddenly, I kick the bucket, they're not going to know who's who. They're not going to know who Maharaja Karm Singh was. They'll look at a picture of him and think, beard, turban, halo, hawk on his arm or something, and must be Guru Gobind Singh. So it's... it happens.
Fair. Another artist that I think a lot of people will have connected to your collection or to yourself is the painting by Schoefft. I can never pronounce his name. Obviously there's one, the one in your collection is the Thuggee painting. So I just wanted to get a little bit of information about him and that painting, but equally there's another painting that's attached to him, which is of Maharaja Ranjit Singh Ji in front of Ard Granth and Dasam Granth. From the little I know, it was painted after Maharaja Ranjit Singh Ji had passed away, and it wasn't a portrait of, it wasn't a live scene, so to speak. But yeah, obviously would love to get your input on that.
Sure. Schoefft is a Austro-Hungarian artist who arrives in Punjab after Ranjit Singh died. So when he gets to Punjab and gets to Lahore, Maharaja Sher Singh is on the throne. In the early 1840s, I think he gets to about 41, 42. And he's a friend and acquaintance of Ranjit Singh's doctor, Dr. Honigberger. And he's also, Orientalist painter, very, very skilled. And interestingly, the 2 paintings that you mentioned, there's 2 that I have of him. One is the one that he does of Sher Singh. So he actually he's presented, he comes to Sher Singh, and Sher Singh says to him, do a quick portrait of me and let's see how good you are. And he does a little sketch and he impresses Sher Singh, and Sher Singh allows Schoefft to paint his portrait. This is an interesting time because you've got this interaction. The Anglo-Sikh War is yet to happen, but this slowly kind of organic kind of interaction between East and West happening, because now what you've got is European artists who are fascinated by India. Equally, the Indians, the Sikhs, Punjab, they're looking at their techniques and what they're bringing over. Lots of things are exchanging. So you've got these artists that are then painting these portraits and pictures for the native people. They're not necessarily painting it for a tourist market. So he paints this picture of Sher Singh, which is the one in the book, and then later on comes back to Europe, and then he expands on it, and that's the largest scene that we now see that's in Lahore. That, interestingly, was brought over for the Arts of the Sikh Kingdoms exhibition in 1999. All right, so the big portrait that he does, which is on the front cover of a really good book, if you've got it, of F.S. Jazuddin's book on Sikh portraits by European artists. It's hard to find, but it's really worthwhile having. And so you'll see that. And this is what's crazy about this stuff. At that exhibition in 1999 at the V&A, that portrait, the big portrait's on display, right? And it's in the catalogue, in the V&A's Arts of the Sikh Kingdoms catalogue. Imagine, right, being an 18, 19-year-old, someone telling you that later on you'll find the original picture that one's made from. You wouldn't believe it, would you? You wouldn't ever dream of that happening, but that's exactly what happened. And this is, that's why I hope, podcasts like this are hopefully inspiring somebody, someone out there in the future to kind of to get involved and kind of get into this, because it's the results can be truly remarkable. And anyway, the two pictures that you connect, and I won't go too much into the Thugs one because it's quite a long story, but you can watch it on YouTube. We did a video back in 2018 at the exhibition which talks about the story behind that picture. But the painting that you talk about with the Ranjit Singh in Darbar listening to two grunts, that's connected to the Thugs painting. And I'd suggest that you can go away and kind of watch that video to kind of see how those two paintings are connected. So Schoefft sadly doesn't see Ranjit Singh. What we have to understand is, because that picture of the Bar Sahib in the background and Ranjit Singh listening to the grunts, we have to understand the way in which these artists painted their scenes. We know that he didn't see Ranjit Singh, so therefore Ranjit Singh isn't in the picture when Schoefft is painting it. We also know from the story that is connected to the Thugs painting that, Schoefft is given permission to stand on top of Ranjit Singh's Haveli overlooking the Bar Sahib so he can start to sketch out this scene. We also can see in that picture, I don't know whether you spotted this before, but if you go away and have a look at the Nihangs in that picture and later on compare them to the Nihang in the Thugs painting, you'll see that it's the same guy. Right, and you'll see that in the Bar Sahib painting, the Nihang turns his head, and you'll see two different aspects, two different profiles of that very same person. So that then goes to tell us that Schoefft has seen a Nihang somewhere, has sketched him, and then he incorporates him in his work later on in different poses, in different ways. Yeah. So now we know that he starts to construct these scenes. He starts to construct these scenes based upon the sketches that he's made over time. So with that in mind, when somebody says, yep, it's Ard Guru Granth and Dasam Guru Granth in the picture, we don't know that. It might be, but it might not be. It might be, there's certainly two Granths in the picture, and Schoefft has probably seen two Granths together. That's why he's showing us that. Do we know that it may well be Ard Guru Granth and Dasam Granth, or it might be, Guru Granth Sahib and another Poti, or maybe he just made it up. We just don't fully know. Do you know what I mean? It wasn't as if it was all happening in front of his very eyes. These are kind of constructed scenes. And then later on, Schoefft, his best picture is I would say the Dasera scene set in the grounds of Lahore Fort, which is in the Lahore Museum, not Lahore Museum, in the Lahore Fort which shows all the characters of Ranjit Singh's court. And that's a wonderful, wonderful, grand picture. And then later on, his works come to England, and Duleep Singh acquires some of his works. So that's quite an interesting thought. Imagine Duleep Singh here acquiring works done by Schoefft of his half-brother, posthumous paintings of his dad, showing, his dad in Darbar in Lahore Fort. It's quick. It comes back here, and then these paintings are then exhibited, and the Thuggee's painting is exhibited here, and then, the Thugs painting goes off to. I won't go into the details of kind of what's being depicted, but I mean, you can read about it in the book or watch the video, but it's just how this stuff happens. So I mentioned earlier to you that my cousins Paramjeet and I grew up very much kind of like in a lot of my cousins and my brother, like in their shadow, and they were 8-9 years older, kind of doing various research in Amandeep and everybody. And I had the privilege of being around them. Really, I just kept my mouth shut and just listened a lot. And I think I must have been about probably, I don't know, maybe 16, 17 probably. And I got a pass to the British Library. And what we would do in those days is nobody had any money. We were just looking for anything connected visually to Sikhs. And we had a particular interest in Nihangs. And, just because they're, so captivating. And then we would just pull out a whole lot of books and just page by page, just comb through these books, just looking for images, looking for anything connected, anything, right? And one day my brother goes there and he pulls out this volume, and he's going through this volume, and he finds a little black and white engraving, and he thinks he's spotted a Nihang. And he says to Paramjeet, he says, I think I've spotted Nihang in this picture. And Paramjeet said, no, it can't be from a distance. He said, I've seen that. I've gone through that before. He goes, I don't think so. Don't worry about it. Leave it. He goes, no, he goes, have a look. And he comes and has a look, and he bloody hell, he says, how do you have it? And it's a little black and white engraving of that Thug's painting, right? And it just shows this Nihang in the foreground, surrounded by these Thugs. So that's it. And suddenly it's like, we're just, everyone's excited because they just found a picture of Nihang. But no one knows anything about this painting existing. But you know that if there's an engraving, where there's a picture somewhere, but where is it? No one's seen it yet. Then, sometime later, I find on eBay some old accounts, some old papers that then talk about this picture, that then where Honigberger's account of why this picture was made, and then there's a bigger engraving of this picture. So and it starts to talk about the artist Schoefft, so on and so on. So now we know the name of the artist, and we know that he did a painting, and we know Schoeff's name and how it's related to Sikhs. So brilliant. A few years on, we find another book called The Orientalists, and in that book, there's a reproduction of the actual painting. Right. So then you finally see this painting that these engravings were based on. But in the book, the artist is, haven't they put Frederick Christian Lewis? They've got the artist wrong, and they haven't attributed it to Schoefft. But they do tell you where the picture is, and it says that it's in James Ivory, in the James Ivory collection, James Ivory Ishmael Merchant Ivory Films, right back in the day. This is James Ivory, famous director. And it's in his collection. So we get in touch with James Ivory. He's based in New York, and say, look, this says that you had this picture. Have you still got this picture? And he says, and he's him and his partner Ishmael Merchant, they co-own this. And he comes back and says, yeah, I do. And he gives us a bit more history as to how they acquired it, where it came from. And we share some of our research with him to say, well, this is what it is, and this is what the artist is, and this is why it was painted. Can we reproduce it one day? Can we just publish it one day? And he says, yeah, it's fine. Do what you need to do with it. And he's very grateful and generous. And then by this time, I've started collecting. And this is, a decade on from finding it, a little black and white sketch of it. Then, sadly, Ishmael Merchant passes away. And all of his collection comes to London for sale. And the best lot that's in that sale is that Thug's painting. So he does full circle. And the description that they have in the catalogue is based upon the research that we provided them. So now it's got all the information attached to it, and it's there. Now it's for sale, and this is like a decade of kind of research And suddenly it's there. And then in that moment, you've got like a decision to make. And in that moment, it's like, I need to buy this. I have to buy this picture, you know. And then I think I got it for my absolute last bid. You know, it was my absolute kind of limit at that time. And then we have the picture. Like, it's just, you know, it's just wonderful. Like the journeys that you go on as a collector, you know, it's a bit of a drug, really, but it's not just as easy as kind of turning up somewhere, flicking through a catalogue and picking something up. Do you know what I mean? It's brilliant. That's a good example, actually, of that kind of journey that you just don't know which way it's going to take you.
I really like that because it's quite wholesome, and equally it's a complete image of actually from start to finish. And you're completely right. It's not easy just to turn up and be like, yeah, I'm going to buy all of these Sikh artifacts. And we've already spoken about how a lot of this is often mislabeled, not necessarily down to anyone's fault. And so even finding some of these pieces, let alone being able to buy them, is just remarkable in its own right. I just find that quite wholesome and ironic that you guys found like the engraving, did the research, and then in the end you had the opportunity to buy it. And then actually all of the education that's come off the back of that YouTube video that you referenced, it is an absolutely brilliant breakdown of the image and the artist. I'd recommend anyone to go and watch it. And yeah, I'd like the realism that you've provided as well in relation to the second image, because yeah, we can assume it is Sri Guru Granth Sahib Ji and Dasam Granth Sahib Ji, but again, that's an assumption. And actually, if we were to break it down and base it on kind of verifiable fact, there's a question mark, because you're right, it could be.
I mean, you know, we don't need, you know, that particular painting to tell us whether you know, the Sikhs respected Guru Granth Sahib and Dasam Granth. You know, at the same time, we've got plenty of accounts that talk about Dasam Granth, and you know, so it's not particularly that we're relying on that. It's and it's just really important, I think, from an artistic perspective. And this is why we shouldn't be shy and actually need to embrace studying art. Is when you start to deconstruct how it's made, how the artists are functioning, how they're working, it then allows you to kind of unpack all the information that then supports or, you know, crushes kind of any other theories that someone might have. Yeah, I mean, if there's any kind of collectors out there, I think from that Thuggee's kind of story, or just while it's in my head, you know, just looking at kind of lessons that you kind of learn in the process of collecting and doing that kind of, you know, going on that journey. No one knew at the beginning when we were looking for stuff, let's say in the British Library, an image, that we're going to one day buy a painting. So you don't know that. You don't know what the end goal is going to be. The only thing that you can ever do is at that time, do the best with what you have available to you. And that in itself just starts to, you know, the road starts to make its own way. You know, it's... in my mind, I've got this vision of, I remember reading about this recently, it's like, you know, Akbar and Jahangir want to go on a holiday to the Himalayas, you know, and but there's no road. So what do? They send 3,000 people ahead of them to build the road as they walk on it, you know. So, you know, think about the destination a little bit, but at the same time, do as much as you can do in the now, with what you know now, to the best of your ability. But at the same time, you know, I got a great piece of advice in my early kind of collecting days from a really established dealer. And he said to me, he said, you need three things. He said, if you're going to make it. He said, firstly, you're going to need some money. He said, secondly, he said, you're going to need some knowledge. And he said, finally, he said, you're going to need some guts. And every now and then, you know, you're presented with a situation where you don't have a lot of time to decide what you're going to do. And you've got to go with your instincts, but you have to make bold decisions, and they will, you know, shape your path and your future. So yeah, I think that's a prime example of that picture.
Moving on then through the collection, one thing that I find fascinating looking at is maps, and just during some of the research that I've been doing, coming across maps that show the Sikh Empire or like the Sikh state, so to speak. It's quite a shock to the system because I never actually imagined that those type of maps even existed, more so because I just never necessarily thought that there was a use for the creation of those things. Obviously, when you dig into it, turns out that there are various reasons for why they were made. Now, when I was just reading through the book, obviously there are numerous maps in your collection. I just wanted to ask, what has perhaps been the most interesting find within the collection of maps? And then secondly, is there any map in particular that is quite striking in terms of what it states or includes?
Maps are they're wonderful in that they're a real document of the kind of evolution of a landscape. And just what I'm kind of in many ways intrigued by is that period, the Misl period, the period between the Gurus and Ranjit Singh. I actually, if I could go back in time to any period, I think I'd probably go back there, and just to see how that landscape was changing. So when I talk about sort of early Sikh art or early kind of period acquisitions, I'm kind of referring to that period, I think, mainly. And I think I'm interested. You can find maps relatively easily, I think, but what I'm interested in is those maps that are pre-annexation, and they show either Ranjit Singh's territories slowly expanding and where the borders are between him and the protected Fulkian states, for example, or you start to see, you probably alluded to, is this the scale of what Punjab was, pre-partition. The scale of the landscape. And you think, God, is that how much land they were governing? Is that where the borders extended to? So I think in terms of and then you find maps in, I think some of the earliest maps that I've got are Swiss, English, and we alluded to this the Swiss in the 1780, 1790, 1791, those kind of, there's maps from that period where the Punjab is being observed. This is, people that are very much interested in the land. It's being, the Europeans are coming, they're planning, and, this is 60, 70 years before the Anglo-Sikh Wars happened, or the Anglo-Punjabi Wars happened, and yet, these early confrontations are already taking place. They're taking place between, people like the descendant of Guru Nanak, Baba Sahib Singh Bedi, George Thomas, these early adventurers. And so the Punjabis are very much aware of who's coming in and kind of how they're documenting the land that we know that they later on conquer. So yeah, I think one particular map, I can't remember what year it is now, but you got various names of various peoples, the Marathas or the Mughals, or the Nawabs in Lucknow, and then suddenly across Punjab it's like it just says savages. It's like, okay, that's the land you don't go into. It's like, oh, okay, that's interesting.
Just out of curiosity, have you come across any maps that were made within Punjab at that time, or was that type of technology, so to speak, not necessarily kind of, I wouldn't say not present there, but it wasn't necessarily kind of what was valued, or what people were going to pay to get made? Whereas obviously with Europeans, Westerners, there was a purpose for them to create these maps, because obviously they were observing these landscapes.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a good question, actually, because I've never found one. Like, I've never found a map in Gurmukhi or Persian, or I've never found one like that, particularly, and it's for the reasons that you say. It's mainly produced from a British kind of European perspective, and most of the maps and all the maps I found here. So it's really good, actually, because I never thought about that. I've never seen one. I would assume if they're going to exist, they're going to exist in India somewhere, or in an archive or a museum in India, I would hope. Probably in the archives in Patiala or something. But no, I've not seen one.
I did wonder, because equally, although I say that there might not necessarily have been a purpose for them, there's equally, I guess, on the flip side, there would have been some mapping of networks. But no, it's interesting to hear as well that someone in your, like where you are in your field, also hasn't come across one yet either. Moving on through the collection, there's one particular weapon that I find quite interesting, and that's the sword of Maharaja Ranjit Singh Ji and the inscription written on it. It's page 57 in the Empire of the Sikhs book. I just wanted to get to know a little bit more about the sword itself, and then what the inscription on it says. And then equally, how do you verify, like, I know you spoke about provenance last time we spoke, but like, how do you verify that item is Maharaja Ranjit Singh Ji's and isn't, I don't know, like a duplicate? Or
so the very, very first Sikh piece that I ever found, out of all the Sikh pieces, was the sword of a king, was a sword of Raja Fateh Singh Ahluwalia, of Kapurthala, who was a contemporary of Ranjit Singh's. And that then sets a bit of a benchmark. When you find a weapon and a sword with calligraphy that belongs to a king, you then know what the quality standards are. Do you know what I mean? So if you have a look at an inscription, you can then go, okay, well, if that was good enough for the king, then now I can kind of look at other inscriptions and I can judge the status of somebody based upon that. And this was a contemporary. I think he was about 4 or 5 years younger than Ranjit Singh, and he and Ranjit Singh became Bhagavat Pra, and they kind of exchanged the stars. They agreed not to invade each other's lands and to help each other. They signed a treaty with the British and met the British together. So you know that these are contemporary. So you get an idea of the quality of a sword or an inscribed sword of a king. The sword that you're talking about is so stunningly beautiful. I remember the first time I saw it, and I found it with a private collector. He really was a private collector, and he didn't know that it was a Sikh sword. And I saw it with him, and I looked at it. I recognised Ranjit Singh's on it. There's various other scenes, hunting scenes, and there's sadhu sitting in contemplation, and there's two warriors dueling with maces, and then you turn it and you see this inscription, and the calligraphy was just, the quality of the inscription was just so fine. It's, to this day, it's the finest Gurmukhi inscription that I've seen on any Sikh sword. And I've got other Sikh swords that belong to kings, or Duleep Singh's Mama, Jawahar Singh, or nobles, or Kushal Singh, like various, Garm Singh Patiala, various, and then you see this, and it's a different level in terms of its quality. It's got Ranjit Singh on it. It's and then after years and years and years, I managed to acquire it, and after years of trying, and the inscription comes from Krishna Avatar from Dasam Granth. And it says, Deg Deg Jag mein do chale, rakh aap moh ko avar na dale. And is directly related to kingship. It's about Deg Deg. It's about Deg Deg Fateh. We know that expression, and you covered it in some of your other podcasts. But is it how do you rule? How do you rule? You rule by feeding and protecting the poor. Then you'll have a just rule, right? Also, it's there's an invocation asking for protection. Look after me. Look after me, to Akal, look after me, don't let my enemies kill me. So who is this for? Who is this for that is going to rule and rule justly, and is requiring this in this talismanic way, this protection from the Almighty? So it raises that. And on top of that, it's the only figural Talwar hilt that I'd come across from that period, that time. You find hilts decorated with flowers. You don't find people chiseled into hilts very often. Weirdly, so I managed to get this, and then a number of years after, I found out that actually it was sold in England many years before in a country sale. And I found the auction catalogue. I bought the auction catalogue, and I've managed to get it somehow. And you start to see no one ever bothered to translate the inscription or to talk about it. And the blade on that sword is a European blade. It's, Wilkinson razors, then people use those for shaving and stuff now, right? So, but traditionally they were making swords, weapons, surgical instruments. Henry Wilkinson. It's a Wilkinson blade, but it's not an ordinary Wilkinson blade because it's a Wilkinson blade made in their Calcutta office. And because of how it's stamped, you can date it. So it's also dated to within Ranjit Singh's life. So if let's say we found a date on it that was 1846, you think, okay, well, the blade's been put in it afterwards. So he died in 1839. So that can't be. But actually, we know that it's contemporary to him. So you kind of slowly start to, in the absence of, a stamp saying, this is my sword, my name's Ranjit Singh, or in the absence of any other provenance, you have to try and piece this information together. So I can't tell you 100%, but I can point and say, well, actually, this is most likely this. On top of that, we know that Ranjit Singh, and we know this through old accounts, he sends Hari Singh Nalwa to go and buy European blades. He sends him off to buy European blades. We also know that in his Doshakhana, and this comes up in the auction catalogues, there are swords that were listed as gifts to him with European blades in. So I would think that this was likely a gift to him, something that was presented to him by somebody that is, flattering him in some way, but it's of such exceptional quality, and it's a foreign gift. It's and they were doing this kind of stuff all the time. So that's what I think that heavily kind of points to that. One day hopefully we'll find an image of it somewhere or a better description of it somewhere. But I've not seen another sword to parallel that. Not even any museum collection in terms of its quality.
I think everything that you put forward makes a lot of sense when you piece it together like that. And I think actually the bit that got me was because I think if you're not aware of the quality standard of it, and for argument's sake that it was created in the Wilkinson office in Calcutta and everything else that kind of goes with that, you may just argue it's just a Sikh sword, quote unquote, because you could, if being devil's advocate, argue that the inscription is like a generic Sikh scriptural inscription. But actually the detail and the fact that you said that other shastras from that time, other swords from that time don't have these ornate scenes carved into them, it makes a lot of sense. And I like it, the fact that actually it's most likely to be this rather than it categorically, it has to be X or Y. Just then moving further on then through the collection, there are 3 items in particular related to Hari Singh Nalwa that are in your book. 2 of them are paintings, so page 107 and page 113. But the item that really caught my eye, and I think it's an amazing piece, is the gold-plated shield of Hari Singh Nalwa. Now, the only reason that it sparked my interest was obviously because it's gold, but secondly because the gold plating shouts to me that it wasn't a shield for a real fight, because like to me that doesn't make sense to go into a real fight with a gold shield. Like it's going to get absolutely smashed to pieces. So I would love to hear the explanation behind that shield, and then also how you came to acquire it and the history behind it.
So with regards to decorative weapons, there's a couple of things that we've got to think about and kind of to understand that better, to put things into context. Firstly, is that we are generally, when we're talking about highly decorative weapons, we're talking about very wealthy people who have these weapons, and these are warriors who are going to go into battle. Equally, they are warriors who occasionally are going to be in a darbar kind of scenario. So you might wear your Sunday best, when you go to meet Ranjit Singh in the darbar. So some pieces are courtly, darbari, and some pieces are going to be a bit more functional. At the same time, we do also know that there are accounts of Sikhs getting, dressed up to the nines to go to war, and they're not just, if I'm so wealthy, I still want to look my best. I don't care if my sword or shield or helmet gets broken. I'll get another one. What's the big deal? How am I gonna show off my wealth and my power? In fact, I'll be even more intimidating if I went into the battlefield and you saw that my shield was diamond encrusted and I didn't care if I lost it. Right? That's even more intimidating. You imagine I suddenly turn up and you knew I was wealthy, but you knew I suddenly turned up in plain armor and a hide shield. You might think, hang on a second, what's he worried about? What's he attached to? Right? And this isn't just theory. We know this from the surrender of the Sikhs. There's an Englishman who writes an account of the surrender of the Sikhs in the Anglo-Sikh Wars, and he talks about a mound of weapons which builds up as these old boys, bow down and drop their swords. And he said this mound of swords builds up, and many of them, he said, are studded with jewels and covered in gold. So you got an account of the surrender after the battles, that there's weapons like that being deposited, and some of these weapons may have been kept for generations. So there's nothing to say here that the Sikhs were not wearing decorative things in battle. You talked about the howitzer, the Sikh gun that you saw in the exhibition. That's highly decorative. That's one of 4 cannon. I don't want to really. A cannon strictly is not a cannon; it's a howitzer, because it's mobile and it fires at a particular trajectory. A cannon's kind of fixed and fires at a lower trajectory. But it's so that howitzer, which is in the book, you'll see how decorative it is. That was firing at the British in the last battle of the Second Anglo-Sikh War. you look at that, it's a work of art. It's got, all this, and you think, what? But that's where it was captured. It's a captured gun. So you look at that as a sign of kind of how decorative some of these objects were. The shield that you're talking about, it's entirely covered in gold. The bosses and the crescent moon Yadjand are set with jewels, and it's inscribed, and it says Akali Phula Hari Singh, and it's dated, wonderfully, like it's dated. It's dated to the equivalent 1824, and Hari Singh dies a couple of years before Ranjit Singh, 1837. He's born in 1791. He's about, what's that? 30. He's 33 years old, right? We think about Hari Singh Nalwa, you think about an old guy. I don't know what you think about. I always think about a guy, for some reason, who's a lot older than me, right? And I think about a long flowing grey beard or greyish beard. He's how old is he? He's 46 years old when he dies. He's young, right? And he's 33 years old when he has that shield. And at that time, 1824, he turns up in the British newspapers. This is 20 years before the Anglo-Sikh Wars, or 15 years before the Anglo-Sikh Wars. And it's, he turns up in there because they're talking about the battle that he's fought and where he's won, and he's lost 500 men and so on. And the date on that, and we've got to do some more research on this. When weapons get dated, whether they're swords or shields or whatever, it's generally speaking, it's commemorating something. Generally, it seems to be like it from what my research kind of telling me based upon the weapons and the arms and armor that I have is that what are these dates connected to? Often it's connected to somebody's death, or it's connected as a presentation gift. They did something that was applauded, and in this case, it just so happens that he fights a very difficult campaign which he's successful in. And is this a presentation gift to him when he comes back? Is this something that marked his victory? The construction of the shield is exactly the same construction that you'd find for a fully functional steel shield. It's an iron steel shield covered in gold. The back of it is completely lined in silk velvet, heavily embroidered in zari work in gold and silver thread. So it's everything that we would expect of him. He is as close as you could get to being a king in terms of the quality of the kind of artifacts that he would have. Yeah, no, it's a great thing, and that surfaced here in England first in a provincial sale, and then completely covered in dirt. It was, and not when I found it, and then it turns up at Christie's, and interestingly and weirdly, I get contacted by Christie's, sending me an image of the inscription saying, "Can you help tell us who this shield belongs to?" And I'm thinking, bloody hell, like here I am the pain of having to tell them that it's Hari Singh Nalwa, and then the pain of having to bid on it. It's a bit like our Beato story.
Yeah. I really find that interesting because you're talking about the wealth and kind of the splendor of the Sikhs during that time. And I just remember coming across I can't remember what book it was, but it's an early European account, and it's about, I think it's written by Reverend Wolfe, and in it he's talking about one of Maharaja Ranjit Singh Ji's generals, one of the European generals. I can't remember which one it was now, maybe Allard, but it was the one who eventually retires in Italy. Anyway, he explains that
Abitable or something.
Yeah, I think it might. Yeah, no, I think you're right. And he explains that, cutting a long story short, Maharaj Sher Singh, I think, gave him £500,000 of his own money at that time, £500,000 of his own money, and it ends up going into the Bank of England. Abitable obviously then comes back to England afterwards, takes the money out, eventually retires, marries his niece or something, and settles down in the south of Italy somewhere.
As you do, yeah.
just like at that time, right? And I did the calculations for what £500,000 would be in today's money. It's about 52 million quid. And I think actually you talking about how we need to view that time period, I think that really showed to me just the sheer wealth that would have been oozing out of these people. Now, another individual who is quite cherished within Sikh history is Akali Phula Singh. One thing that I would love to get your input on, just from your understanding of this time period, is the relationship between Akali Phula Singh and Maharaja Ranjit Singh Ji is always a topic of great interest, and there's this happy relationship, but it's equally kind of slightly almost seen as tense as well. Now, one thing that I found interesting going through the depictions of Akali Phula Singh was, if the relationship between him and others in power or those with wealth was actually that bad, then creating his image doesn't make sense, because like you wouldn't want to propagate that name or like share that idea or whatever. And those images of Akali Phula Singh existing almost kind of say that he was the image of him at the contemporary time isn't necessarily what we might have today. And I just wanted to get your input on what you know about him and the relationship between him and Maharaja Ranjit Singh Ji, just from the items in your collection and your own understanding.
Yeah, I think one of the best my favorite image of him is probably, I think it's your avatar, isn't it? I think it's from the Guime. I think that's probably one of the best images of him, which is, we know that's probably coming from one of the French, probably from Court, isn't it? I think it's Court's collection, General Court's collection. And I mean, he's one of the heroes, he's one of the heroes stroke villains of that time, according to which way you want to look at it, depending on who's viewing him. So people like him are being depicted, in the aftermath of Ranjit Singh's death and the Anglo-Sikh Wars, when you find a lot of these portraits surfacing, and he, we know about the Nihangs and the Akalis and what their role was, and how it was very distinct from the Darbar and Ranjit Singh's court. And we talked about the early kind of European advancements in the Misl period, and people like the Phula Singh, they were very wary of the British and of Ranjit Singh's accommodation of them. Ranjit Singh had a different plan in his mind and was being cordial. Perhaps he knew that that they were an enemy that he didn't necessarily want to face out of choice. And the Akalis were ever ready to kind of face them and kind of expel them as quickly as they could. So I think they've got this constant kind of, not rivalry, but they've got this constant kind of different way of approaching kind of what they should be doing. I think what's beautiful, though, is how, and this is what we probably struggle to kind of reconcile, is how one minute, you hear these stories of, Ranjit Singh taking British, taking someone through the bazaars, and then the Akalis jump out and start chucking mud at him and swearing at him and attempting his life in front of, they attempt his life, man. They jump out and start hurling mud and abuse at him. You think, who are these wild tigers that can just challenge the king so kind of brazenly? And yet, when the time comes and he needs assistance and he needs help, he knows that they're the ones in the front. They're the ones that are right in the vanguard, kind of doing all the crazy stuff. And all you just got to read an account of Akali Phula Singh's death, at Nashera, where you read the account, the contemporary account of how he dies. I don't think I've ever read anything that kind of makes the hairs on the back of your kind of neck stand up. You read that account, how he's charging at the Afghans, how he gets shot, he falls off, he mounts another elephant. The guy, the Mahout on the elephant, doesn't want to go ahead, shoots him, gets him out of the way, charges ahead, gets shot, falls off the elephant, and then immediately just charges into this group of Afghans. And it's just, the spirit in that story is immense. And I forget where this is now, so I'm going to have to look this up, but I know that there's an account of when Ranjit Singh hears, remember that his relationship with Akali Phula Singh is a prickly one. When he hears of Akali Phula Singh's death, he goes and visits and gets there. He gets there too late. He gets to that battle too late, and he gets there and he goes in to the battlefield and finds the remnants of Akali Phula Singh's body that's been hacked, and then he takes weapons from Akali Phula Singh's dastar and takes them back with him, and he sheds a tear. And we don't know. And those weapons probably went back to the Toshakhana, Chakkars and Khande and Tirmukhi or whatever. And then we don't know where they are, where they've gone, whether they might be the weapons on display that we can't detect anymore. But he's a wonderful figure, and I think just in their relationship, it's a bit of a microcosm of lots of relationships that we encounter and see that are complicated, that are grey. They're not all love, they're not all hate, they're everything in between. And I think that's what's remarkable about both of those men.
I really like that. I was just sat there in awe just listening to that. As I said in the last conversation we had, I could just literally just listen to you talk and explain.
I can't listen to myself anymore.
And yeah, getting that information and that description of those two individuals, and especially Akali Phula Singh, who is, as you rightly said, a hero or a villain, depending on how you view that time period. It's amazing. I guess this next item in your collection equally signifies, or perhaps is a good example of how relationships, identities, and that time in particular was not black or white. It was quite fluid, and as you said, everything in between. And that's the battle standard on page 228. It often finds itself at the center of whether the soldiers at the time would identify as Sikh or Hindu. I personally, and I'm sure plenty of other people listening, would argue the case about what those terms mean and everything that goes with it. But obviously, as it's in your collection and the knowledge that you've got about this item, like, what can you say about the battle standard in relation to then the fluidity of identity at that time?
Yeah, I think that battle standard, and this is where collectively, this is why I'm kind of glad over time, and why I've been forced to kind of collect cross kind of media in terms of collecting a battle standard or a sword or a painting or whatever, or a manuscript, that they then feed into each other and overlap and just further enhance our kind of collective learning of what that period was like. And it, as you say, it's fluid. Here we are looking through a particular Western kind of diasporic kind of lens, from a mindset that we don't even appreciate, that has evolved over time. And we're trying to define things, and we're trying to, put a definition on people who weren't even necessarily putting a definition on themselves. That's surely got to be impossible to do. And we see that and from a practical perspective, we've got to understand that landscape. So I don't really like using the term Sikh art. I don't really like using the term Sikh kingdom, because what was Punjab? Punjab was 10% Sikh, if you want to label it that. And the Anglo-Sikh wars, Anglo-Punjabi wars, there were Hindus, Sikhs, Muslims, Europeans on one side, Hindus, Sikhs, Muslims, Europeans on the other side. We forget that. We naturally just think English on one side, Sikhs on the other. It's so easy to think about it in that way. And the genius, I think what the battle standard depicts, why should we suddenly be alarmed when we see these images, when, the Granths, whether it's the Ard Granth or the Dasam Grantha, are full of this imagery and iconography and metaphoric language, because it's the vernacular, it's the language of the people at the time. And the genius of the gurus, whether it's Guru Nanak or Guru Gobind Singh, is to speak to people in the language that they understand. And the Europeans said this about Ranjit Singh. You could say the same thing about Guru Gobind Singh, which is that they had this ability to appreciate what your skills were, and then on top of that, get the best out of you. So they could detect it, and then they could, bring it out of you even more. And it's why, people flock to Guru Gobind Singh, and is why the Europeans flock to Ranjit Singh. So that, it's a visual language. It's a visual language of the people. It's talking to them in all that they understand. We know that the Akalis and the Hangs have taken the form of Shiva. We know that, Guru Gobind Singh is talking about Bhagwati, Durga. We know that it's a battle standard that came from a group of battle standards that were captured in the Anglo-Sikh Wars, and then went to the collection of Lord Dalhousie, who was the Governor General, and then they were sold back in 1990. I managed to get 3 of them out of that group of 10 or 12 since. And, you find images of Hanuman and Durga on them. And if you just saw them in isolation, you'd think, nah, come on, what's this? Like, this can't be if I then show you a painting of Hari Singh Nalwa, and there's a very similar, and it's in the book, of Hari Singh Nalwa with his entourage, and in the foreground you've got these Nihangs, and you've got a completely cosmopolitan mixed group of people around him. You know, long hair, short hair, clean shaven, bearded, all sorts of characters, and you've got these red and green, you know, these emerald and crimson flags in the foreground, but in there you see Kalaga, you see another dark manifestation of Durga on these flags. You begin to understand that, okay, this was the language of the people. This is what they understood, and this wasn't seen as necessarily Hindu or Sikh iconography, and it wasn't, you know, it wasn't this. The Sikhs weren't iconoclasts in any way, and it wasn't this form of idol worship. If anything, what they had done is they had brought these idols to life. They had given them form and shape, whether it was in the accoutrements of the battlefield or the edge of the blade. You know, it was bringing these avatars kind of to life. And then you start to think, how sophisticated, how kind of detailed, and like how cultivated these people were to be able to do that, to translate that and then give it new shape, new form, new meaning, which brought people together under one banner. So that, I mean, that's how I translate that when I look at it.
No, I really like that. I think there's two things off the back of it that kind of caught my interest. And when you're describing the image of the different battle standards in the painting of Hari Singh Nalwa, it reminded me of a lot of the battle scenes in Mahabharata and how that would then have almost been mirrored, in that, like, it's almost like the gods have turned up to fight. And in the common man at that time, that is their vernacular. So seeing all of these deities, of avatars, whatever you wish to label them, it makes sense. Equally, I think just in relation to the kind of the identity issue, I think the other thing that we've got is we often look back at history and kind of put a religious tinge on it. And I think actually a lot of that happens in order to try to differentiate Sikhs as being good. So often whenever I post anything to do with any of the Dogras, people are always like, yeah, those traitors, those whatever, blah, 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 they're Hindu, and all of whatever else that goes with it. And I think actually a lot of this kind of trying to segment, oh, this is the Sikh empire, this person isn't then Sikh, is to almost try and be like, oh yeah, we're good and they're bad. And I think the beauty of all of these conversations, equally with this one and the last one that I've had with yourself, it's followed in the theme of all the others, which is it's being real about the history, and it's actually portraying these people as human. And actually there's good, bad, ugly on all sides. So just like for argument's sake with the Anglo-Punjab wars, as you said, Sikhs, Hindus, Muslims, Europeans fighting on both sides. So I guess actually calling it the Anglo-Sikh wars doesn't really do it justice. And we're almost whitewashing parts of history away by mislabeling it, or perhaps trying to make it fit into a particular box that we think or we feel it should go into.
I think this is something that we have to be careful of. We have to, you know, you often, you know, let's say from a martial arts perspective, you know, you often cause yourself more damage in the long run based upon your reaction to something, as opposed to the actual initial blow itself that comes in the first place, is your subsequent kind of reaction to something. And here now we have an opportunity to talk about Sikh heritage or to share it. And we've got to do that carefully, because, you know, and this is pretty much what happened in the early 20th century, or, you know, soon after annexation. And you can understand, you know, naturally how this happened, you know, how people needed to kind of define themselves again. But in that process, you know, you can potentially lose something which takes you further from your original starting place, even if you think somehow, or you convince yourself somehow that you're getting closer to the source or closer to the truth. And you know, we're here for just digging it all up and let the water get a bit murky so we can see it all before we kind of decide what's what. So we're information gathering, aren't we, at this stage?
Yeah, no, definitely. Just then kind of wrapping up with the last few questions. Now, I'm assuming you've seen Black Panther, and there's a particular scene in there where they're in the museum and the character is basically telling the lady who works there that all of these items were originally stolen. They shouldn't even be here in the first place. And give me a few minutes and I'll kind of take them off your hands. And as you can imagine, that is almost kind of, in a nutshell, what a lot of people would just automatically default fall into, and especially if they haven't perhaps gone and researched and investigated a little bit further. Like, for argument's sake, we were talking in the last conversation about how there was the quiver that there was a big hoo-ha about, and actually it turns out that it wasn't stolen, it was gifted. Now, I just wanted to get your understanding, and to be honest, we've kind of touched upon this as we've just been talking. Like, you've made clear that you're not actually a private collector by strictest definition. So, like, with that all in mind, what do you think of this entire idea of these items shouldn't be in the museums? And I guess especially in the landscape that we've seen in Britain, statues being torn down and all the rest of it. What are your opinions, I guess? Like, what would you say to those people who are like, yeah, none of these items should be in these museums. We should have them. I don't know quite what that means. I don't know who we is, but just for argument's sake, what would you say?
I think it's all of this, these are opportunities to learn, opportunities to discuss our very complicated collective history. I'm sitting here now talking to you, living in England, born here, wearing Western clothes. I'm not sitting here in a kurta pajama talking to you from India, right? And we're talking in English, and my Punjabi is terrible, So I'm not going back. I'm perfectly comfortable here, aren't I? At the end of the day, if I was so uncomfortable here, then I would go back. And I think I might want to go back if it was the same as it was pre-annexation. I might choose to want to. I might want to live there then. But it's changed since then. We lost those battles. We lost, right? And that's something that we've got to come to terms with. We had traitors in our own ranks. There's various reasons as to why the Punjab was lost. Ranjit Singh didn't leave a good legacy plan. He was great and all the rest of it. But there were things that were messed up. And that is the nature of civilizations and empires and people, people who are not flawless and humans. And then just to understand, that we were also part of that game. We talked about how in the Misl period, Sikhs are killing Sikhs, fighting Sikhs, taking each other's territories, lands. The Sikhs didn't take anything off someone else? Did Ranjit Singh never plunder someone's treasury or take their loot? Or did that never happen? So I personally, if I'm completely frank with you, I collect, items connected with Duleep Singh and Rani Jindal. I'm not particularly captivated by Duleep Singh or Rani Jindal, to be honest with you. If you really look at it, it's very convenient to kind of turn them into heroes or victims of the Panth. But actually, when you look at it to a deeper level, I'm not that enamored by them, if I'm honest with you. I think it's important to think about their story and understand and collect artifacts related to them so we can discuss things, but I'm not about to make them into these kind of saints of the past. The Duleep Singh story, particularly tragic. He's a child, but we lost. Not everything was stolen, and now we find ourselves in a position where, actually, in hindsight, had these artifacts remained in India, they might not be here. We might not be having this discussion now. If the museums in India or the gurdwaras in India were keeping their things, wonderfully preserved, really researching them, and then we could talk about, look, it's a perfect place for them to be. But I told you that I've been to the Maharaja Sahib Museum and seen fakes in the cabinets and wondered where the real things have gone. So, we're in I've seen that scene in Black Panther, and I have troubles with it, really, if I'm frankly honest with you, because I don't think we can approach this confrontationally. I don't think, I'm not an advocate for those statues and sculptures being taken down and chucked in a river. I think they should have been taken down and put in a museum, and then big, massive, labels attached to them talking about the true characters or natures of these people, so we can learn and understand what happened because now, if those statues are gone or they're taken away or whatever, we don't get to discuss. We don't get to find out, and history remains hidden to us. So when a museum has found itself possessing these artifacts, let's say the British Museum or whoever, it doesn't apply to all the artifacts that they had. But right now, our objective is to open dialogue with museum collections who are very keen, the people that I know anyway, who are keen to, they've taken over certain roles. There's a new generation of curatorship. There's a new generation of curatorship and scholars who are as keen as you and I to understand what they have, so we can start to work collectively on our shared cultural heritage. The people in that museum now are not the people who stole those things from us, but we now can work out what we can do together. We don't have a place for those things to be housed, and for those places, there's not a single decent Sikh museum in the world where these artifacts can be put on display. I don't want to see them in a Langar Hall exhibition. We're above that. We're beyond that now. Right? We have to push forward. We have to, rival those institutions in our collections, in our scholarship, in our understanding, in our openness to provide accessibility. So I think we've got to, there's a movement at the moment where we're talking about colonialism a lot and the effects of it on us. And those discussions have to be had, and we've got to expose everything for what it is. But at the same time, we need to work constructively in a positive way to say, what are we going to do with this now? Now that we find ourselves in this position, given that I'm born here, raised here, speak English, what are we going to do now? How are we going to provide education to everybody, whether they're English, black, white, or Sikh, or Punjabi, or Muslim, whatever? How are we going to provide that education? There's a risk, if you, let's say if you're colonized and someone steals your stuff and then you're deprived of that, it only takes a generation for you to be completely starved of your cultural identity and your kind of living traditions. And then you're deprived of that. And then you put so much pressure on your colonizer to say, look, here, that stuff, those things you got off us, we want them back. Be careful, because they might just turn around and go, here you go. They might just hand it to you quickly. And you've just like I was talking about this analogy between in the martial art, my reaction, my evasion from a punch can get me into more trouble if I'm not doing it correctly or instinctively. I haven't even been hit yet, but I've caused more problems for myself. And if they suddenly do that and you're not equipped mentally, culturally to handle having these artifacts in your possession, they might actually be lost forever, right? So you just imagine now, for example, this collection in the book, it suddenly goes back and someone puts pressure for it to go back to the Darbar Sahib. Are you going to feel safe, secure, really, in your heart? I wouldn't. But what I'm saying that we have to do is to say, look, okay, let's say if these objects existed in a particular museum and it was proven that they were stolen from us, say, look, you've benefited from this for 6 generations or whatever it is, or a few hundred years, and our community was deprived, and we had to change and we restructured, and then we emigrated, and then this happened to us, and I lost this, and then my dad became a labourer, and now this has happened, and over generations and generations, we become weakened. You have a responsibility before we think about taking ownership of those objects, if at all, to educate us, help us, to do a gentle, general handover. Is a responsibility to your colonizer to try and give back what they took from you. And that isn't just in the physical sense of handing you something back. Do you know what I mean? Everybody has an agenda. Everybody has some kind of agenda, one or another. You can't rely on me, let's say, just because I've got a turban and beard and I'm a Sikh in whatever sense you want to think, to tell you the best story, or to tell you, to give you the best research. And, equally, you can't just assume that someone who's English and works in a museum is going to not tell you that story. Do you know what I mean? I sometimes don't. I don't really. That quote where history is told by the victors and all that. It's not always true, man. is not always true. You can read early accounts written by Europeans of the Sikhs that are very admirable accounts where people got thrown out of the army, died in poverty because they were telling the truth. Right, so it's not always that case, and I think we've got to be mindful of that.
I think just in the conversations that we've had, and it's a recurring theme actually throughout most of the podcast, is that it's a real appreciation or a real sense of history. And I think the issue that I think you've highlighted really nicely is that we have a tendency to look back in our history and view it as a black and white issue, it's A or B, it's good or bad, it's like Sikh or Hindu, for argument's sake. And actually the tangible artifacts that you have, other collections that are out there, goes to show that those black and white narratives aren't true. And actually there's a lot out there to challenge that. Whilst I was putting together questions for this podcast, I came across that you had been planning to do an exhibition this year in Toronto, I think. Obviously, COVID is up in the air at the moment and everything else that goes with it. What are your plans for the next exhibition? Is it kind of just up in the air at the moment because of COVID, or do you have anything in the diary?
So there's a few interesting things that I think that are happening, and it's they've all they were up in the air for a while and they were delayed for a bit, and then now we're just kind of sitting on them, kind of just waiting for things to settle because everything's ever changing. So there are a few exhibitions that I've kind of wanted to try and do. One was just a kind of grand scale exhibition, either here in London or abroad. Again, just kind of looking at the court of Ranjit Singh, but looking at the kind of celebrating the kind of cosmopolitan nature of it, and then trying to access and bring out more objects from museum collections that haven't seen the light of day. So that would be nice. I'm also in discussion of thinking about doing a photographic exhibition. So looking at photography from the late 19th, early 20th century that might have, without giving too much away, that might have some more topical leanings, I suppose, that would make it a bit more interesting for people. And then also exploring, depending on how long this might last, is actually also exploring exhibitions in the digital world that we are all too familiar with now. And those to run alongside any physical exhibitions that might happen. COVID and lockdown has given kind of me the opportunity to kind of look at going through the collection and cataloguing it slowly, and that's opening up a number of different themes and subjects that eventually get explored.
There's just a few, like a set of questions that people had sent in, and then there's just one last question that I'd love to ask you. So I guess I can kind of give you these three together because I'd expect the answer to be quite short, to be fair. So people were asking, during your time as a collector, have you come across any paintings of women in Khalsa attire? The second one then is, have you come across any manuscripts of pre-colonial Rait Maryadas? And then the last one is, have you come across or are you aware of any existing scarlet tunics of the Fauj-i-Khas?
Yeah, so I'll quickly answer them in reverse because I remember them. The tunic of the Fauj-i-Khas, no, I haven't seen one. Only in images. I've never physically seen one or come across one. They must exist somewhere, but I've not seen one. And actually, to be honest with you, I haven't actually researched it well enough to even know that I would detect it if I did see it. So yeah, that's something to keep an eye out for. The pre-colonial Rait Maryade manuscripts are hard to come by in the private art world, and although I have some manuscripts, I haven't ever come across a Rait Maryade myself that outside of those that we all would have come across or known about that are in either family collections or Gurdwara collections. No, sadly not. I'm afraid on that one. I don't have any pre-colonial Rait Maryade in the collection. Women in Khalsa attire, I think just like you mentioned, you do see, same as it is today. You'll find women with the stars, women without the stars. You'll find women with weapons and women without, and same as with men, I suppose. But with regards to Khalsa attire, whatever that definition is, the only ones that I can think of really are the women with the star bunge or high juras with small dastars that you occasionally see in, paintings around about sort of 1848 and 50, company school paintings, where often, they're paintings that are associated with the Akalis and the Hungs. I think my favourite one, I couldn't tell you I can't tell you off the top of my head the source, but it's in Warrior Saints. Amandeep and Paramjit found a lovely picture, a lovely watercolor of a woman who's in the Khalsa, who's sitting on the back of a horse, and you can tell that initially when you look at the image, you might think that it was a young man, but actually you can see from the salwar and the pajama that actually it's a young woman with a dastar bunga.
No, I think I know the one that you want about. It's almost like an orange beige
painting,
background,
so
and she's
out.
I think she's on a horse or a donkey, I think it's a horse or a donkey or something. And yeah, no, I'll definitely pull that out actually. And then the last question, what would your advice be to those starting out collecting or thinking about getting into collecting?
Yeah, I think some of it we've covered, and I think I'd probably just share the same advice I think that was given to me, really, because it served me well. If you don't have enough funds to collect at the moment, whatever, nothing stopping the internet. There's so much valuable information out there in terms of books or Google books, auction catalogs and things like that. Start looking, let it slowly kind of seep in. Don't be in too much of a rush to collect. Things turn up. Things turn up when you least expect them to. And if you spent all your money on lower end things, then when something decent turns up, you run out of cash. So, just take it easy. If you've got £1,000 to spend, don't buy 5 things for 200 quid each. But wait for that one thing for £1,000. It will serve you better as an investment and allow you to build and improve your collection. And it's not necessary, but it's quite nice and quite good to kind of think about specializing or having a specialist area that you can focus on, and just keep plowing away. And see as much as you can see, whether it's good or bad, go and see it, whether it's in a museum or whether it's in a sale, if you're buying it or not. Try and make a trip to see something, and you'll find that you recall upon that visual memory later on. So, yeah.
No, thank you. It's really, really helpful. Once again, I can only repeat how grateful I am for you making the time out to do this, and actually instigating the second conversation. Genuinely appreciate it. I'm slightly apprehensive sometimes of pushing too much, just in case it becomes kind of slightly irritating. But no, I just wanted to check, is there anything in particular that you want to include, or anything that we might have missed out?
No, I think it's good. I think we covered a lot of ground, and no, I just want to say thanks to you for all your hard work. And I can see and appreciate all the research that you do with your Instagram page, and I've certainly benefited from it, and look forward to your posts. And thanks for the opportunity. I've enjoyed it.